So we come to chapter 9. And in this chapter we meet Miss Squeers. We meet again Mrs. Squeers, Master Squeers, and Mr. Squeers, and find out various matters and persons connected no less with the Squeerses than with Nicholas Nickleby. When Mr. Squeers left the schoolroom for the night, he betook himself, as he had before, to his own fireside, which was situated not in the room in which Nicholas had supped the night of his arrival, but in a very much smaller apartment in the rear of the premises, where his lady wife, his amiable son, and accomplished daughter were in the full enjoyment of each other's society. Mrs. Squeers being engaged in the matronly pursuit of stocking darning, and the young lady and gentleman being occupied in the adjustment of some youthful differences by means of a pugilistic contest across the table, which, on the approach of their honoured parent, subsided into a noiseless exchange of kicks beneath it. And in this place it may well be a praise to the reader that if Miss Fanny Squeers was anything, she was in her 23rd year. If there be any one grace or loveliness inseparable from that particular period of life, Miss Squeers may be presumed to have been possessed of it, as there is no reason to suppose that she was a solitary exception to the universal rule. She was not tall like her mother, but short like her father. From the former she inherited a voice of harsh quality, from the latter a remarkable expression of the right eye, something akin to not having one at all. Miss Squeers had been spending a few days with a neighbouring friend, and had only just returned to the parental roof, so this circumstance meant that she had heard nothing of Nicholas until Mr. Squeers himself now made Nicholas the subject of conversation. "Well, my dear," said Squeers, drawing his chair up to the fire, "what do you think of him by this time?" "Think of who?" inquired Mrs. Squeers, who, as often as she remarked, was no grammarian, thank God. "Of the young man, the teacher. Who else could I mean?" "Oh, Knuckleboy," said Mrs. Squeers impatiently. "I hate him." "And what do you hate him for, my dear?" said Squeers. "What's that to you?" retorted Mrs. Squeers. "If I hate him, I hate him. That's enough, ain't it?" "Quite enough for him, my dear, and a great deal too much, I dare say, if he knew it," replied Squeers in a pacific tone. "I only asked out of curiosity, my dear." "Well then, if you want to know," rejoined Mrs. Squeers, "I'll tell you. I hate him because he's a proud, haughty, consequential, turned-up-nosed peacock." Mrs. Squeers, when excited, was accustomed to use strong language, and moreover to make use of a plurality of epithets, some of which were of a figurative kind, as the word peacock, and further to the allusion to Nicholas's nose, which was not intended to be taken in its literal sense, but rather to bear a latitude of construction according to the fancy of the hearers. Neither were they meant to bear reference to each other so much as to the object on whom they were bestowed, as will be seen in the present case, a peacock with a turned-up nose being a novelty in ornithology, and a thing not commonly seen. said Squeers, as if in mild deprecation of this outburst. "He's cheap, my dear. The young man is very cheap." "Not a bit of it," retorted Mrs. Squeers. £5 a year? £5 a year, my dear. What of that? It's dear if you don't want him, isn't it? Replied his wife. But we do want him, urged Squeers. I don't see that you want him any more than the dead, said Mrs. Squeers. Don't tell me. You can put on the cards and the advertisements. Education by Mr. Watford Squeers and his able assistants. You can say that without having any assistants, can't you? It's done every day by all the masters about. Oh, I've no patience with you. Haven't you? Said Squeers sternly. Now, I'll tell you what, Mrs. Squeers. In this matter of having a teacher, I'll take my own way, if you please. A slave driver in the West Indies is allowed a man under him to see that his blacks don't run away or get up to a rebellion, and I'll have a man under me to do the same with our blacks, till such time as little Wackford Squeers is able to take charge of the school. Am I to take charge of the school when I grow up to be a man, father? Said Wackford Junior, suspending in the excess of his delight a vicious kick which he was just about to administer to his sister. So you are, my son, replied Mr. Squeers in a sentimental voice. Oh, my eye, won't I give it to them boys? Exclaimed the interesting child, grasping his father's cane. Oh, father, won't I make 'em squeak again? It was a proud moment in Mr. Squeers' life when he witnessed that burst of enthusiasm in his young child's mind and saw it as a foreshadowing of his future eminence. He pressed a penny into his hand and gave vent to his feelings, as did his exemplary wife, also in a shout of approving laughter. The infantine appeal to their common sympathies at once restored cheerfulness to the conversation and harmony to the company. He's a stuck-up monkey. That's what I consider him, said Mrs. Squeers, reverting to Nicholas. Suppose he is, said Squeers. He's as well stuck up in our schoolroom as anywhere else, isn't he? Especially if he doesn't like it. Well, observed Mrs. Squeers, there's something in that. I hope it'll bring his pride down, and it shall be no fault of mine if it doesn't. Now, a proud subordinate in a Yorkshire school was such a very extraordinary and unaccountable thing to hear of, any subordinate at all being a novelty, but a proud one, a being of whose existence the wildest imagination could never have dreamt. That Miss Squeers, who seldom troubled herself with scholastic matters, inquired with some curiosity who this knuckle-boy was that gave himself such airs. Nickleby, said Squeers, spelling his name according to some eccentric system which prevailed in his own mind. Your mother always calls things and people by their wrong names. No matter for that, said Mrs. Squeers. I see them with the right eyes. It's quite enough for me. I watched him when you were laying down on that boulder this afternoon. He looked as black as thunder all the while, and one time started up as if he'd got more than an idea in his mind to make a rush at you. I saw him, though he thought I didn't. Never mind that, father, said Miss Squeers, as the head of the family was about to reply. Who is this man? Why, your father's got some nonsense in his head that he's the son of a poor gentleman that died the other day, said Mrs. Squeers. The son of a gentleman? Yes, but I don't believe a word of it. If he's a gentleman's son at all, he's a fondling. That's my opinion. Mrs. Squeers intended to say a foundling, that is, an orphan. But as she frequently remarked when she made any such mistake that it would be all the same 100 years hence, with which axiom of philosophy, indeed, she was in constant habit of consoling the boys when they laboured under more than usual or ill usage. "He's nothing of the kind," said Squeers in answer to the above remark. "He's not a foundling, for his father was married to his mother years before he was born, and she's alive now. If he was, it would be no business of ours, but we make a very good friend by having him here, and if he likes to learn the boys anything beside minding them, I've no objection, I'm sure." "I say again, I hate him worse than poison," said Mrs. Squeers vehemently. "If you dislike him, my dear," returned Squeers, "I don't know anybody who can show the dislike better than you. And, of course, there's no occasion with him to take the trouble to hide it." "I don't intend to, I assure you," interposed Mrs. Squeers. "That's right," said Squeers, "and if he has a touch of pride about him, and I think he has, I don't believe there's a woman in all England that can bring about anybody's spirit down where it should be as quick as you can, my love." Mrs. Squeers chuckled vastly on the receipt of these flattering compliments, and said she hoped she had tamed a high spirit or two in her day. It is but due to her character to say that in connection with her estimable husband she had indeed broken many and many a one. Miss Fanny Squeers carefully treasured all this up, and much more conversation on the same subject, until she retired for the night, when she questioned the hungry servant minutely regarding the outward appearance and demeanour of Nicholas, to which queries the girl returned such enthusiastic replies, coupled with so many laudatory remarks touching his beautiful dark eyes and his sweet smile and his straight legs, upon which last named article she made particular stress, the general run of legs at Dotheboys Hall being crooked, that Miss Squeers was not long in arriving at the conclusion that this new subordinate must be a very remarkable person, or, as she herself significantly phrased it, someone quite out of the common. And so Miss Squeers made up her mind that she would take a personal observation of Nicholas the very next day. In pursuance of this design, the young lady watched the opportunity of her mother being engaged and her father being absent, and went accidentally, of course, into the schoolroom to get a pen mended, where, seeing nobody but Nicholas presiding over the boys, she blushed very deeply and exhibited great confusion. "Oh, I do beg your pardon," faltered Miss Squeers. I thought my father was or might be. Oh dear me, how very awkward." "Mr. Squeers is out," said Nicholas, by no means overcome by the apparition, unexpected though it be. Do you know how long he will be, sir?" asked Miss Squeers, with bashful hesitation. "He said about an hour," replied Nicholas, politely, of course, but without any indignation, being stricken to the heart by Miss Squeers' charms. "I never knew anything happen so cross," exclaimed the young lady. "Thank you. I'm very sorry I intruded. I'm sure. If I hadn't thought my father was here, I wouldn't upon any account have. Oh, it is very provoking. It must look so very strange," murmured Miss Squeers, blushing once more and glancing from pen in her hand to Nicholas at his desk and back again. "If that's all you want," said Nicholas, pointing to the pen and smiling in spite of himself as the affected embarrassment of the schoolmaster's daughter, Perhaps I can supply his place. Miss Squeers glanced at the door, as if the dubious nature of the propriety of advancing any nearer to an utter stranger was too much to contemplate. Then she looked around the schoolroom as though in some measure reassured by the presence of 40 boys, and finally she sidled up to Nicholas and delivered the pen into his hand with a most winning mixture of reserve and condescension. "Shall it be a hard or a soft nib?" inquired Nicholas, smiling, to prevent himself from laughing outright. "Oh, what a beautiful smile he has," she thought. "Which did you say?" said Nicholas. Oh, dear me, I was thinking of something else for the moment, I declare," replied Miss Squeers. Oh, soft as possible, if you please." With these words, Miss Squeers sighed. It might be to give Nicholas to understand that her heart was soft, and that the pen was wanted to match. Upon these instructions, Nicholas made the pen. When he gave it to Miss Squeers dropped it, and when he stooped to pick it up, Miss Squeers stooped also, and they knocked heads together, whereat 25 little boys laughed aloud, being positive for the first and only time that half year. "Very awkward of me," said Nicholas, opening the door for the young lady's retreat. "No, not at all, sir," replied Miss Squeers. It was my fault. I was all my foolish. Oh, good morning." "Goodbye," said Nicholas. "The next I make for you, I hope, will be less clumsily made. Oh, take care, you are biting the nib off now." Oh, really?" said Miss Squeers. "So embarrassing that I scarcely know what I'm very sorry to give you so much trouble." "Not the least trouble in the world," replied Nicholas, closing the schoolroom door. "Oh, I have never seen such legs in all my life," Miss Squeers thought, as she walked away. In fact, Miss Squeers was in love with Nicholas Nickleby. To account for the rapidity with which this young lady had conceived a passion for Nicholas, it may be necessary to state that the friend from whom she had so recently returned was a miller's daughter of only 18, who had contracted herself unto the son of a small corn factor resident in the market town. Miss Squeers and the miller's daughter, being her fast friend, had covenanted together some 2 years before, according to a custom prevalent among young ladies, that whoever was the first to be engaged to be married should straightway confide the mighty secret to the bosom of the other, before communicating it to any other living soul, and bespeak her as bridesmaid without loss of time. In fulfilment of which pledge, the miller's daughter, when her engagement was formed, came out to express at 11 o'clock at night, as the corn factor's son made an offer of his hand and heart, at 10 by the Dutch clock in the kitchen, and she rushed to Miss Squeers' bedroom with the gratifying intelligence. Now, Miss Squeers was 5 years older and out of her teens, which is also a great matter, and so she had been more commonly anxious to return the compliment and possess her friend with a similar secret, but either in consequence of finding it hard to please herself, or harder still to please anybody else, had never had an opportunity to do, inasmuch as she had no such secret to disclose. The little interview with Nicholas had no sooner passed, as above described, however, than Miss Squeers, putting on her bonnet, made her way with great precipitation to her friend's house, and upon a solemn renewal of divers old vows of secrecy, revealed how that she was not exactly engaged, but going to be, to a gentleman's son. None of your corn factors here, but a gentleman's son of high descent. This gentleman's son had come down as teacher to Dotheboys Hall, as Miss Squeers more than once had hinted. So she had good reason to believe that he was a gentleman's son indeed. By the fame of her beauty and many charms, it was quite clear that he had come to seek her out and to woo and win her. "Isn't it an extraordinary thing?" replied Miss Squeers emphatically. "Most extraordinary," replied the friend. "But what has he said to you?" "Oh, don't ask me what he said, my dear," replied Miss Squeers. "If only you had seen his looks and his smiles! Oh, I was never so overcome in all my life." "Did he look at you in this way?" inquired the miller's daughter, counterfeiting as nearly as she could a favourite leer of her corn factor. "Aye, very much like that, only more genteel," replied Miss Squeers. "Ah," said the friend, "that means he means something, depend upon it." Miss Squeers had slight misgivings on the subject, but was by no means ill-pleased to be confirmed by a competent authority, and discovering on future conversation and comparison of notes a great many points of resemblance between the behaviour of Nicholas and that of the corn factor, grew so exceedingly confidential that she entrusted her friend with a vast number of things that Nicholas had not said, which were also very complimentary as to be quite conclusive. Then she dilated the fearful hardship of having a father and a mother strenuously opposed to her intended husband, on which unhappy circumstance she dwelt at great length, for the friend's father and mother were quite agreeable to her being married, and the whole courtship was in consequence as flat and commonplace an affair as it was possible to imagine. "How I should like to see him!" exclaimed the friend. "And so you shall, Tilda," replied Miss Squeers. "I should consider myself one of the most ungrateful creatures alive if I denied you. I think mother's going away for 2 days to fetch some boys, and when she does, I'll ask you and John up for tea and have you meet him." This was a charming idea, and having fully discussed it, the friends parted. It so fell out that Mrs. Squeers' journey to some distance to fetch 3 new boys, and done the relations of 2 old ones for the balance of a small account, was fixed that very afternoon for the next day but one. And on the next day but one, Mrs. Squeers got up outside the coach as it stopped to change at Greta Bridge, taking with her a small bundle containing something in a bottle and some sandwiches, and carrying besides a large white top-coat to wear in the night-time. With such baggage she went on her way. Whenever such opportunities as these occurred, it was Squeers' custom to drive over to the market town every evening on pretence of urgent business, and stop till 10 or 11 o'clock at night at a tavern which he much affected. As the party was not in his way, therefore, but rather afforded a measure of compromise with Miss Squeers, He readily yielded his full assent hereunto, and willingly communicated to Nicholas that he was expected to take his tea in the parlour that evening at 5 o'clock. To be sure, Miss Squeers was in a desperate flutter as the time approached, and to be sure, she was dressed out of the best advantage, with her hair, it had more than a tinge of red, and she wore it in a crop, curled up in 5 distinct rows, up to the very top of her head, and arranged dexterously over the doubtful eye, to say nothing of the blue sash which floated down her back, and the worked apron, or the long gloves, or the green gauze scarf worn over her shoulder and under the other, or any other numerous devices which were to be as so many arrows to the heart of Nicholas. She had scarcely complimented these arrangements to her own satisfaction when her friend arrived with a whitey brown parcel, flat and 3-cornered, containing sundry small adornments which were to be put on upstairs, and which the friend put on, talking incessantly. When Miss Squeers had done the friend's hair, and the friend had done Miss Squeers' hair, throwing in some striking improvements in the way of ringlets down the neck, and then when they were both touched up to their entire satisfaction, they went downstairs in full state with their long gloves on, all ready for company. "Where's John, Tilda?" said Nicholas. Said Miss Squeers. "Oh, he's gone home to clean himself," replied the friend. "He'll be here by the time the tea's drawn." "Oh, I do so palpitate," replied her friend. "Aye, I know what that is. I've not been used to this, you see, Tilda," said Miss Squeers, applying her hand to the left-hand side of her sash. "Oh, you'll soon get better of it, my dear," rejoined her friend. While they were talking thus, the hungry servant brought in the tea things, and soon afterwards somebody tapped at the room door. "There he is! There he is! Oh, Tilda!" "Hush, hush!" said Tilda. "Say, come in." "Come in!" cried Miss Squeers faintly, and in walked Nicholas. "Good evening," said the young gentleman, all unconscious of his conquest. "I understood from Mr. Squeers that—" "Oh, yes, it's all right," interposed Miss Squeers. "Father don't take tea with us, but you won't mind that, I dare say." She said this archly. "Well, we're only waiting for one more gentleman," said Miss Squeers, taking the teapot lid off and looking inside the teapot to see how the tea was getting on. It was a matter of equal moment to Nicholas whether they were waiting for one gentleman or 20, and so he received the intelligence with such perfect unconcern, and being out of spirits and not seeing any special reason why he should make himself agreeable, he looked out of the window and sighed involuntarily. As luck would have it, Miss Squeers' friend was of a playful turn, and having heard Nicholas sigh, she took it into her head to rally the lovers to their lowness of spirits. "But if it's caused by my being here," said the young lady, "don't mind me for a bit, for I'm quite as bad. You may go on as if you were alone." "Tilda," said Miss Squeers, colouring up to the top row of curls, "I'm ashamed of you." And here the two friends burst into a variety of giggles, and glanced from time to time over the top of their pocket handkerchiefs at Nicholas, who, for a state of unmixed astonishment, gradually fell into one of inexpressible laughter, occasioned partly by the bare notion of his being in love with Miss Squeers, and partly by the preposterous appearance and behaviour of the two girls. These two causes of merriment, taken together, struck him as being so keenly ridiculous that, despite his miserable condition, he laughed until he was thoroughly exhausted. "Well," thought Nicholas, "as I am here, and seem expected for some reason or other to be amiable, it's of no use looking like a goose. I may as well accommodate myself to the company." We blush to tell it, but his youthful spirits and vivacity getting for a time the better of his sad thoughts, he had no longer formed this resolution than he saluted Miss Squeers and the friend with great gallantry, and drawing a chair to the tea table, began to make himself more at home than in all probability a servant should ever have done in his master's house, since servants and subordinates were not usually invited. The ladies were in full delight of this altered behaviour on the part of Mr. Nickleby, when the expected swain arrived, with his hair very damp from recent washing, and a clear shirt, whereof the collar must have belonged to some giant ancestor, forming, together with a white waistcoat of similar dimension, the chief ornament on his person. "Well, John," said Miss Price, which, by the by, was the name of the miller's daughter. "Well," said John, with a grin that even the collar couldn't conceal. "Oh, I beg your pardon," interposed Miss Squeers, hastening to do the honours. "Mr. Nickleby, Mr. John Browdie." "Servant, sir," said John, who was something over 6 foot high, with a face and body rather above the proportion than below it. "Yours to command, sir," replied Nicholas, making fearful ravages on the bread and butter. Mr. Browdie was not a gentleman of great conversational powers, so he grinned twice more, and having now bestowed his customary remark of recognition on every person in company, grinned at nothing in particular, and he helped himself also to the bread and butter. "Your old woman's been awa'," said Mr. Browdie to his Matilda. Miss Squeers nodded assent. Mr. Browdie gave a grin of special width, as if he thought it was really something to laugh at, and went to work on the bread and butter with increased vigour. It was quite a sight to behold how he and Nicholas emptied the plate completely between them. "You won't get bread and butter here every night, you know," said Mr. Browdie, after he sat staring at Nicholas for a long time over the empty plate. Nicholas bit his lip and coloured, but affected not to hear the remark. "Eee!" said Mr. Browdie, laughing boisterously. "Ha! They don't put too much out for invites. You'll get nothing but skin and bones here if you stop here long enough. Ho, ho, ho! There'll be nothing left of you." "You are facetious, sir," said Nicholas scornfully. No, I don't know," replied Mr. Browdie. "But t'other teacher, he were a lean one." The recollection of the last teacher's leanness seemed to afford Mr. Browdie the most exquisite delight, for he laughed until he found it necessary to apply his coat cuffs to his eyes. "I don't know whether your perceptions are quite keen enough, Mr. Browdie, to enable you to understand that your remarks are becoming offensive," said Nicholas in a towering passion. "But if they are, have the goodness to—" "Don't say another word, John," shrieked Miss Price, stopping her admirer's mouth as he was about to interrupt. "Only half a word, and if you do, I'll never forgive you or speak to you again." "Well, me lass, I don't care for him," said the corn factor, bestowing a hearty kiss on Miss Matilda. "Let him see what he likes.
Let him do what he likes. I don't care about him.
It now became Miss Squeers' turn to intercede with Nicholas, which she did with many symptoms of alarm and horror. The effect of the double intercession was that he and John Browdie solemnly shook hands across the table with much gravity. And such was the imposing nature of the ceremonial that Miss Squeers was overcome and shed tears.
"What's the matter, Fanny?"
said Miss Price.
"Nothing, Tilda, nothing,"
replied Miss Squeers, sobbing.
"There never was any danger," said Miss Price. "Was there, Mr. Nickleby?"
"Oh, none at all," replied Nicholas. "Absurd."
"That's right," whispered Miss Price. "Say something kind to her, and she'll soon come round. Here, shall John and I go into the little kitchen and come back presently and leave you two together on your own?"
No, not on any account," rejoined Nicholas, quite alarmed at the proposition. "What on earth should you do that for?"
"Well,"
said Miss Price, beckoning him aside and speaking in a low voice with some degree of contempt,
"you are one to keep company."
"What do you mean?" said Nicholas. "I'm not one to keep company at all. Here, at all events, I can't make this out."
"Oh, no, nor do I neither," rejoined Miss Price, knowingly. "But men are always fickle, and always were, and always will be. That I can make out very easily. You are fickle."
"Fickle!" cried Nicholas. "What do you suppose? You don't mean to say that you think that Miss Squeers and I are—"
"Oh, no, I don't think anything of the kind," retorted Miss Price pettishly. "But look at her, dressed so beautiful and looking so well, really almost handsome. Mr. Nickleby, I am ashamed of you."
"My dear girl, what have I to do with her dressing beautifully or looking well?" inquired Nicholas.
"Come, don't call me my dear girl," said Miss Price, smiling a little though, for she was pretty, and a coquette too in her small way, and Nicholas was good looking, and she supposed him the property of somebody else, which were all reasons why she should be gratified to think she had made an impression upon him. "Come, Fanny will be saying it's all my fault. Come, we're going to have a game of cards." Pronouncing these last words aloud, she tripped away and rejoined the big Yorkshireman. This was wholly unintelligible to Nicholas, who had no other distinct impression on his mind at the moment than that Miss Squeers was an ordinary-looking girl, and that her friend Miss Price was a pretty one, but he had not time to enlighten himself by the reflection, for the hearth was being swept and the candle snuffed, and it was time for them to sit down and play speculation. "There are only 4 of us, Tilda," said Miss Squeers, looking slyly at Nicholas. "So we had better go partners, 2 and 2 together." Again she looked archly at Nicholas. "What do you say, Mr. Nickleby?" inquired Miss Price.
"With all the pleasure in life," replied Nicholas, and so saying, quite unconscious of his heinous offence, he amalgamated into one common heap those portions of a Dotheboys card of terms which represented his own counters and those allotted to Miss Price respectively. "I should be glad to be your partner."
Mr. Browdy,
said Miss Squeers hysterically.
shall we make a bank against them?
The Yorkshireman assented, apparently quite overwhelmed by the new subordinate's impudence, and Miss Squeers darted a spiteful look at her friend and giggled convulsively. The deal fell to Nicholas, and the hand prospered. "I do declare that we intend to win everything," said he.
Tilda has won something she didn't expect. I don't suppose you did, dear. Did you?
said Miss Squeers maliciously.
Only 12, love,
replied Miss Price, affecting to take the question in a literal sense.
How dull you are tonight,
sneered Miss Squeers.
No, indeed, replied Miss Squeers.
Miss Price.
I am in excellent spirits. I was thinking you seemed out of sorts. Me?
cried Miss Squeers, biting her lips and trembling with jealousy.
Oh, no. Very well, remarked Miss Price. Your hair's coming out of curl, dear.
Thank you for...
Never mind me,
tittered Miss Squeers.
You had better attend to your partner.
Yes, you had better attend to me, said Nicholas. The Yorkshireman flattened his nose once or twice with his clenched fist, as if to keep his hand in until he had an opportunity of exercising it upon the features of some other gentleman. And Miss Squeers tossed her head with such indignation that a gust of wind raised by the multitudinous curls in motion nearly blew out the candle.
I have never had such luck with another partner,
exclaimed coquettish Miss Price, after another hand or two.
And it's all down to being partner with you, Mr. Nickleby. It's all down to being partner with you. I wish I could have you as my partner always.
I wish you had.
You would have a bad wife, though, if you always won at cards.
Not if your wish were gratified, replied Nicholas. I'm sure I should have a very good one in that case. To see how Miss Squeers tossed her head, and the corn factor flattened his nose while this conversation was carrying on, it would have been worth a small annuity to have beheld that, let alone Miss Price's evident joy at making them jealous, and Nicholas Nickleby's unhappy unconsciousness of making anybody uncomfortable. We've done all the talking to ourselves, so it seems, said Nicholas, looking good-humouredly around the table as he took up the cards for a fresh deal.
You do it so well,
tittered Miss Squeers,
that it would be a pity to interrupt it, wouldn't it, Mr. Browdy? Ho, 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 ho!
Nay, said Nicholas, we do it in default of anybody else failing to talk.
We'll talk to you, you know,
if you'll say anything, said Miss Price.
Thank you, dear,
retorted Miss Squeers majestically.
Or if you can talk to each other.
If you don't choose to talk to us, said Miss Price, rallying her dear friend.
John, why don't you say something? Say summat,
repeated the Yorkshireman.
Well then, said the Yorkshireman, striking the table heavily with his fist, what I say is this: dang me bones and body if I could stand it no longer. What are you damned subordinate? What are you, young whisperer? You better look sharp out for a broken head next time you come under my hand. Mercy on us, What's all this about? Said Miss Price, in affected astonishment. Come on, woman, come on me, replied the Yorkshireman sternly, and as he delivered the reply, Miss Squeers burst into a shower of tears, arising in part from a desperate vexation, and in part from impotent desire to lacerate someone's countenances with her fair fingernails. This state of things had been brought about by divers means and workings. Miss Squeers had brought it about by aspiring to the high state of and condition of being matrimonially engaged without good grounds for having done so. Miss Price had brought it about by indulging in three motives of action. First, a desire to punish her friend for laying claim on a rivalship and dignity, having no good title. Secondly, for the gratification of her own vanity in receiving the compliments of a smart young man. And thirdly, a wish to convince the corn factor of the great danger he ran in deferring the celebration of their nuptials, while Nicholas brought it about by half an hour's gaiety and thoughtlessness, and a very sincere desire to avoid the imputation of inclining at all to Miss Squeers. So the means employed and the end produced were alike the most natural in the world. For young ladies will look forward to being married. They will. And they will jostle one another to the altar in their race to get there. And they will avail themselves of all opportunities of displaying their own attractions to the best advantages down to the very end of time. That is how young ladies behave, indeed, as they have behaved from the beginning of time.
Why, and here's Fanny in tears now, exclaimed Miss Price, as if in fresh amazement. What can be the matter?
Oh, don't you know, miss? Of course you do. Pray don't trouble yourself to inquire, said Miss Squeers, producing that change of countenance which children call making a face.
Well, I'm sure, exclaimed Miss Price.
And who cares whether or not you are sure, ma'am? Retorted Miss Squeers, making another face. You are monstrous polite, ma'am, said Miss Price. I shall not come to you to take lessons in that art, ma'am, retorted Miss Squeers. You needn't take the trouble to make yourself plainer than you are, ma'am, however, rejoined Miss Price, because it's quite unnecessary.
Miss Squeers, in reply, turned very red and thanked God that she hadn't got the bold faces of some people. Miss Price, in rejoinder, congratulated herself upon being possessed of the envious feeling of other people, whereupon Miss Squeers made some general remark touching the danger of associating with low persons, in which Miss Price entirely coincided, observing that it was very true indeed, and she had thought of it for a long time.
Tilda, exclaimed Miss Squeers with dignity, I hate you.
Ah, and there's no love lost between us, I was sure, said Miss Price, tying her bonnet strings up with a jerk.
You'll cry your eyes out when I'm gone, I know you will.
I scorn your words, minx, said Miss Squeers. You pay me a great compliment when you say so, answered the miller's daughter, curtsying very low. Wish you a very good night, ma'am, and pleasant dreams attend you asleep. With this parting benediction, Miss Price swept from the room, followed by the huge Yorkshireman, who exchanged with Nicholas at parting that peculiarly expressive scowl from which the cutter and thrust counts in melodramatic performances inform each other that they are sure to meet again. They were no sooner gone then Miss Squeers fulfilled the prediction of her friend by giving vent to a most copious burst of tears and uttering various dismal lamentations and incoherent words. Nicholas stood looking on for a few seconds, rather doubtful what to do, but being certain whether he felt that it would fit the end in his being embraced or scratched, and considering that either infliction would be equally disagreeable, he walked off very quietly, with Miss Squeers still moaning into her pocket handkerchief. Well, this is one consequence, thought Nicholas, when he had groped his way to the dark sleeping room, of my cursed readiness to adapt myself to any society in which chance carries me. If I had sat mute and motionless, as I might have done, this would not have happened. He listened for a few moments, but all was quiet. I was glad, he murmured to himself, to grasp at any relief from the sight of this dreadful place, or the presence of its vile master. I have set these people by the ears, and made 2 new enemies where, heaven knows, I needed none. Well, it is a just punishment for my having forgotten, even for an hour, what is around me now. So saying, he felt his way among the throng of weary-hearted sleepers, and crept into his poor bed.